Welcome back, guys. I've had a few of you ask me how I create the two-tone effect on my leather projects, just like you see in these pictures right here. It's a very simple process. I'm going to run you through how I like to go about doing it. Like most of leathercraft, it does come down to personal preference, and there are a few different ways you could do this. But in today's video, I'm going to run you through probably the simplest method, so sit back, relax, and let's jump into this video. In my most recent video, I tooled out this little sample piece, so I'm going to piggyback off of this project. This is what I'm going to be two-tone dyeing today. Other than that, you just need some dye, and I prefer the Fiebings Pro Dye, and in this video, I'm going to be using the dark brown color. The only reason that I say I prefer the Pro Dye is because throughout my personal experience, I can get the most consistent results with this, but use whatever you want. And then you also just need some cheap paintbrushes. I say cheap, I go with cheap paintbrushes. Whatever you want to go with is fine. This is just one from Hobby Lobby, and then this is one from Tandy. Other than that, you're really good. You can keep some paper towels around. Obviously, it can get really messy. And then I like to just lay this little cutting mat down on my table to keep from getting my table dirty. And then also, you can transfer your dye into a smaller container to make it a little bit easier to work with. I'm just going to stick it in this roll of tape right here to hopefully keep it from getting knocked over and spilling and making a big mess. But other than that, we're ready to go. Now obviously the two-tone effect that I'm showing you in this video is not the only two-tone effect that you can get with leather. There's a lot of other ways that you can go about it. Two-tone just simply means that the tone or color scheme of the leather is two different hues or two different colors, whether that be lighter and darker of the same color or two completely different colors. So do some experimenting with other methods if you'd like, but this video is just covering what I usually do with most of my tooled projects and that I've been asked about in emails and comments and so on and so forth. So moving into step number one, and this is my preferred way of going about it. I've let this project completely dry out after I've done all of my carving and tooling, and the very first thing I do after it's dry is I add one coat of 100% pure neatsfoot oil. You can use whatever oil you want, and if you don't oil your projects, that's up to you. And here's where it can get tricky. Some people say, should I oil before I dye or after? That's completely up to you. Whatever you get the best results with, do that. I personally feel like I get the more consistent results of my dye work if I oil my project beforehand, but go about it however you want. But the only thing that I've done to this project so far is it has one single coat of 100% pure neatsfoot oil, and that has been given plenty of time to dry in and soak up evenly into the leather. So when you actually go to load your paintbrush with dye, you want to get an adequate amount on there, but as you can see, that has a big glob dripping off the tip. Before you pull this out of whatever container you're using, you want to make sure that you just dab it on the side and get all of that excess that could potentially drop or splatter off of that paintbrush. The first thing that I like to start with is the outside of my tooling, or these borders right here. So I'm just going to start laying some of this dye down, and as you can see, it kind of bleeds when you touch it to the leather. So that's why you got to be really careful when you make your first initial contact. But after I go through and get this border dyed, then I'm going to start working my way into the backgrounds. Something that I always try to pay attention to is the inside of this border as well. If you take a close look at it, you can see where this little ridge, the inside of it didn't catch any of that dye on my first pass. So I always tip it up and make sure that I am getting the inside of this border so my dye work wraps all the way around that and doesn't just sit on the top side. You do got to be very careful when you are working on this part though, because a little slip and you could make a mess pretty easy. Another thing to keep in mind when you are doing this is it's okay to go back and forth slowly, but you don't really want to sit here and whip like this back and forth really quick, because if you do have a lot of excess dye in your paintbrush, it can, if those bristles catch, it can just kind of fling dye and splatter it in places where you don't really want it to be. So just kind of take your time. There's no fast way to go about it. It's just be careful and do the best you can. Try to stay aware of any dye that could potentially be building up on your paintbrush like this as well. I like to always keep an eye out for that and make sure that I keep my paintbrush as clean as I can, because you don't want that accidentally getting on your fingers and then touching your clothing or accidentally touching the project and getting it dirty. So try to keep everything as clean as you can too. Using these paintbrushes can be kind of slow, but I like to just take my time with everything I do. I know some of you have probably seen Joe Mealing's videos where he uses the large foam brush to hold a lot more dye and cover a larger surface area when you're doing these borders or a large project. But again, I just like the safety and control of this paintbrush, so that's just my preferred method. You can do however you want. I've even seen some people load dye into a little spray gun and dye their projects like that. It's really just whatever you're comfortable with. Go ahead with that. This is just slow and controlled for me, so that's just what I do. So to give this project a true two-tone look, we're not only going to dye these borders, we're going to dye the backgrounding too. So the main concept of this is obviously going to be this vine structure, oak leaves and acorns, and then if you look closely, you have the background. And whichever backgrounding tools you decide to use is ultimately up to you. This particular project I used bar grounders, which is what I primarily use. I love the look of bar grounders, but you have to be very careful when you're dyeing them. If you look closely, it's a lot of little bitty circles that are kind of interconnected with these channels, and when you're dyeing these bar grounded backgrounds, those channels will allow the dye to migrate throughout them, and if you have too much dye loaded into your paintbrush and touch it into that bar grounded area, it could migrate through those channels into your main artwork and permanently dye that. So let me get some dye on my paintbrush and show you more about what I'm talking about. I always recommend starting in a large section like this and then slowly working your way to the smaller sections. As you can see, I'm just barely touching that down and the dye just starts running away in those channels. If you're using more of a matted background or something a little bit more flat, not as textured, you don't have to be as careful. You still need to be really careful, but you don't have to be as careful. Like you see with this, how I'm just barely touching it and that dye just runs. And it's not going to come out perfect. There's going to be a few mistakes. There's going to be a couple small places where you got dye that you didn't necessarily want it to be. It's part of it. It's handmade. We're humans. We make mistakes. We obviously want it to come out as good as we can make it, but it's not going to be perfect. Just do the best you can and focus on all the good.
And that's about all there is to it, guys. It's a really simple process. One thing that I did do off camera was add a second coat of dye. I personally like to add at least 2 coats of dye to make sure that everything does absorb into the leather evenly and doesn't look splotchy. And then I would also recommend at least 30 minutes to an hour of dry time to make sure that everything has had time to absorb into the leather evenly. The dye actually absorbs into the leather and it doesn't just sit on top of it like paint. And then you can finish it however you want from here, but if you're interested in how I go about finishing probably 95% of the projects that I make, tap this video right here. It's going to cover all of my finishing steps in detail, including this one. I really hope this helped answer some of your questions and help some of you guys out. If you have any additional comments or concerns or anything like that, leave them in the comments. I'd love to hear your feedback, and I'm sure I didn't cover everything perfect in this video. But thank you guys for watching. Until next time, we'll see you.